Yesterday. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Eventually. Moments later. Moments later. 10 seconds later. 12 seconds later.
1 minute later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later.
5 minutes later. 2 minutes, a little longer than a few minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later. 20 minutes later. Many minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 5 hours later. 6 minutes later. Hours later. 6.5 hours later. 7 hours later. 8 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later.
12 sleepless hours later. Several hours later.
Several song-filled hours later. Many hours later.
Take it away.
Many unbearable hours later. 24 hours later. The next day. 12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m. The next morning. 1 pair of pants later. The annoying shift later. 2 idiots later. Montage. What follows is
Let's
a
go
brief
to the
construction
Christmas.
montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. 1 winner later.
1 operation later. A few inches later. Several bad puns later. A lot of boring math later. 298 frozen patties later.
Thousands of tears later.
And whoop who's later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later. Opening night. The very next evening. 8:01 p.m. Epilogue. Tomorrow for sure. Day 2. 2 days later. 48 hours later. Day 3. 3 days later. 72 hours later. Day 4. 4 to 6 days later. Several days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 1 week later. The following Thursday. 2 weeks later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later. Several months later. Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later. 2,000 years later. 3,000 years later. 1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later.
5 billion years later.
1 eternity later. Later in the void. Much later. Much later.
Much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.